Welcome to the Did You Know Quilting Show. I'm Christina Whitney, and I am here today with part 2 of the t-shirt quilt. So last week's question was, did you know that you can piece a t-shirt quilt on the long arm? Well, last week we showed how to do the prep work. This week we're going to jump into the stitching. Welcome back to the t-shirt quilt. So again, this is part 2. I do want to remind you that I'm working on 2 separate quilts. One has the orange backing and one has the gray backing. So don't get confused if you see 2 different things. And also reminding you that the orange backing was really short, so I'm going against all rules and I'm working as close to the edge of that fabric as I possibly can. So I may or may not have my side clamps on depending on what area I'm working in. One other thing that I have changed since the last video is that I have dropped my frame from standard view into clear view. So what that means is that my poles are down lower and I don't have that extra pole across the top here. So that hopefully will let you see better without that blocking any of your view. Okay, so I went ahead already and I basted down the sides, and now I'm going to do what I call a wiggle stitch, or you could do a straight stitch, either way. And I'm just going to stitch down all of the raw edges. Let's look around. My first raw edge is going to be over here. So I've got the glide foot on here. That is probably a must-have for this project. Especially with these jerseys that are spandex, there's a lot of shifting that's going to be going on. And like even this section right here, it's a bunch of things that are pieced together so they're not meant to lay flat. And I'm going to be doing a little bit of manipulating to try to make them flat. So what I'm going to do is check my settings real quick. And I am in a cruise mode at 150. I'm at 12 stitches per inch, and I think I'm good with that. Okay, let's go back down to the quilt. This isn't going to be a super fast process at this point. Oh, one other tip. Did you know that when you are stitching and you have pro stitcher gears engaged, it's pretty stiff? So what I just did was disengage the gears on my pro stitcher so that I can move smoothly. And I'm just wiggling around. I might get a couple little tucks and puckers. I'm not overly concerned because I will be coming back and covering this raw edge in part 3 of this video series. And I'm just going to travel over to this next section here. And I might have to smooth things as I'm going. That's fine. Just always be aware of how much overlap you have. So I just hit the end of my throat space right here. So I didn't get over to this quilt. That's okay. To this shirt. I started laying down the second row of my shirts just so I'd have a visual. So what I'm going to do is, instead of breaking my thread, I'm just going to travel back up that same line. And then I can continue across. Okay, I've got a pin here. If you used pins, make sure you take those out. That's my tip for the day. Okay, one other thing that's important is when you're doing these wiggle stitches that you make sure you know which piece of the fabric is on top and that you're stitching on the one that's on top. Sometimes it kind of is hard to tell, maybe some depth perception issues and stuff. So yeah, always make sure that you're stitching on the top layer. Okay, so I've got that section. I have not done anything on this one. I'm gonna jump over because I don't want to hit any pins up at the top. Normally I would just stitch that section, but now I've got this neckline that I want to stitch down. I'm getting a little bit of bunching. I'm just going to smooth things out. Put the next layer back on. Now, sometimes the fabric wants to roll over when I stitch over, so you can just lift that foot up over the top, get things back in place. Okay, black is on top. Okay, let's take a look here. So I've got all of my edges stitched down, and you might be asking, why am I doing that wiggle stitch instead of just a straight stitch? I found that with some of these stretchier fabrics, the wiggle stitch sometimes helps to keep things in place. One thing to think about though as you're doing this is, yes, we're doing a lot of overstitching and we're going to be adding more onto that. So think about your backing. You are going to see the stitching on the backing. So maybe use a busy fabric that the thread will blend in with, or even a minky where you'll just see all of that texture. But just things to think about. You can use whatever you want. No rules, no quilting police for this project. Okay, now with that wiggle stitch done, I have two options here. I can go ahead and do an all over design, stitching that whole thing down in that throat space, then advance, put the next row on, do the rough edges or the raw edges, stitch the whole thing and advance and keep doing that. Or what I'm going to do for this project is I'm going to just do the raw edges right now. And then when I'm completely done, I'm going to go back and do an edge to edge through the entire thing using the Pro Stitcher with a design that I created just for this school. So with that being said, I'm going to show you a quick little video on the other quilt where I did option number 1, where I stitched the overall inside each one of the throat spaces individually. Now, before I advance the quilt and start adding more layers of t-shirts, what I'm going to do is take a picture of this so that I remember which t-shirts are where, so I can always make sure that I keep things balanced, because, you know, throughout this project I am shifting things a little bit here and there. So in part 1 of this video, I showed you how I mark my backing. So I would mark like 10 inches, 20 inches, 30 inches, whatever, so that I could gauge how far down I've gone in the backing. Now I've gone ahead and I just put some pins in here because I can't really draw on the backing because there is no space left. But those pins mark 10 inches, 20 inches. So the total length of this, I believe, is about 60 inches. So to this point, that's my top third. Now I can go back and look at the picture that I took of the full layout, the rough layout, and make sure that I'm keeping in within that 1/3 space. And then same thing when I move down to the next section, making sure that I'm keeping those t-shirts all spaced evenly, so when I get to the bottom, I'll be good. So that's the goal. We'll see. I have done some shifting because things weren't fitting exactly how I wanted once I did the trimming, but that's all going to work out at the end. So taking off those side clamps and advancing the fabric. I'm actually going to drop my needle down so I know how far back I can go without leaving little gaps. I'm going to call that good for now. Now my backing is kind of stretchy, so I'm going to give it a bunch of slack. See how it's just hanging down there? And then I can tighten it up just a little bit without stretching it. Okay, let's get everything smoothed out. I'm going to lift that needle before I forget. I'm going to fluff the batting, make sure it's lining up on the side here. With the fabric advanced, I'm going to do a little bit of flipping for this next layer so that I can do some trimming of the rows that are already stitched down. So I've got this one here. I'm going to flip that over, and I'm not really measuring anything. I'm just making sure I've got at least a 1/2 inch of coverage. I generally go with a lot more than that, just because I've done it a few times and ended up with not having enough backing, or not backing, not having enough of the two t-shirts to overlap each other. Okay, so I'm going to move my machine out of the way. Got this white t-shirt that I probably could have trimmed back quite a bit more. Probably should have trimmed that one before I did the stitching. On this side, I definitely have plenty of overlap. On this side, it's going to be really close. So what I can do is kind of manipulate this, since this fabric is very fluid, just kind of smooth it a little bit, and I could get away with that overlap there. Perfect. Maybe unstitch a couple of those to smooth it out. Whatever I feel like at that moment. Okay, now underneath this one, I can do a little bit of the trimming. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and keep putting on more layers, doing the same process. until I get down to the bottom. Got my first row mostly stitched down. I only stitched low enough that I can cover the logo of that particular t-shirt. And then I've put the second layer over the top just to get my spacing and everything figured out. And now I'm going to go back and do the trimming of the first row. So I flipped the t-shirts back just enough that I know I'll have enough overlap. And then I'm taking my scissors and I'm just trimming off the extra at the bottom of that t-shirt. I'll just take those pieces out. That will reduce some of the bulk. Flip the shirts back in place. Pull this one up just a little bit more. Now this one actually was mesh, and I put a lining on the back of it. So that one is taken care of. And then I'll just continue trimming, put these all back in place, and then do that wiggle stitch to stitch the second row down, just the top part where the label or the logo is, and then advance, put the next one on, and continue. I've made it to the bottom of my backing, and I went ahead and I did a basting stitch across the bottom. It's in just a little bit, but that will give me a nice guideline for when I'm ready to trim it up. And also I want to point out that there are going to be some kind of wobbles. This is a section where the fabric was seamed and didn't lay quite flat. So I got a little bit of puckering over here. I have no excuse, that was just me. But I'm not overly concerned with this at this point because I am going to be covering that up with some couching later on. And also when I do my edge-to-edge stitching, that will help cover up some of those oopses. That is how I do it, piecing my t-shirt quilts on the Longarm. So I gave you a couple of different options, but I want you to remember the most important things is to, first of all, make sure that the shirts overlap sufficiently. And secondly, that you relax and don't stress if things aren't completely perfect. This technique isn't for everyone. Some people will love it, some people will hate it. If you love it, I would love to hear from you. Next week, join me as I show you how I cover up the raw edges with couching. Thank you for joining me today. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and have so much fun quilting this week.